Hello, everybody. It's the Alco Diesel Guy. Many of you are probably familiar, if you're frequent watchers of my channel, about a story I told about a rather bad experience I had with an IHC locomotive, International Hobby Corporation steam locomotive I received in 1996 for Christmas. Essentially, the locomotive deteriorated until it was a pile of parts about a month later, and essentially went up in storage, and to this day I have no idea what happened to it. So it might come as a shock, but today's review is in fact of another International Hobby Corporation steam engine, and this particular steam locomotive is not a, well, typical example of an IHC locomotive, and I'm not just talking about the Minuteman paint scheme. I'm referring to directly that this locomotive actually has a DCC and sound decoder installed apparently from the factory. The locomotive itself did not come in its original box. I believe it to actually have been part of a set. Now, before I get into the review of the locomotive itself, let's talk about IHC, the company that produced this locomotive. IHC, or International Hobby Corporation, was formed in 1982, and if these models on the screen that you're viewing right now look sort of familiar in some way or another, you guessed it. They are in fact Mehano models. The company essentially specialized and/or was the direct importer for Mehano in the United States, much like another previously organized company, AHM. It's not clear as to whether or not Mehano owned part or all of the IHC Corporation. What is clear is they definitely did work together to import their locomotives and rolling stock and train sets themselves into the United States. The company also is known for taking over the Tyco stock, what was left after the Tyco Model Trains division was shut down in 1993. They even provided stand-in rolling stock as Tyco's manufacturing wound down in 1993, leaving them with literally no trains to place in their sets, or even to market under their division. The company was also known for producing several different train sets that went to grocery stores in the United States, and of course under its own Mehano name in Canada and a few other areas of the world. The company was shut down somewhere in the mid-2010s, and with this, essentially Mehano stopped importing trains directly into the United States, with the exception of some of its own models being marketed as Mehano and being sold on Amazon from what I've seen. And now we get to talk about this locomotive. Again, it's a 462 type locomotive, that is to say 4 guide wheels, 6 drive wheels, and 2 wheels supporting the cab. It also has a tender. The side rods are very nicely put together and seem to move pretty smoothly, although the locomotive is a bit of a jerky affair. We'll get more into that later on. As you can see, the cab and other such details are there, but not so that you would see them quite as much. A lot of things seem pasted on. We also note that the annoying drawbar on the back isn't very realistic, and the very sloppy looking plug that actually connects the tender with the actual locomotive itself seems to be thrown together and somewhat crude. That said, the tender, as we'll see in a second, actually does have pickups, assisting the locomotive with getting over switches and long dead sections of track. Now let's take a good look at the actual pickups on the tender itself. These are again the rather infamous metal contact wipers that wipe against the axles themselves. These are known for coming out of shape eventually. Now, I have to admit, I'm not a fan of these, to put it mildly, if you haven't figured it out yet, especially if you've watched all of my reviews. But with this locomotive, they don't seem to be much of an issue. We'll see more of that later. My main concern, again, is that these will need to be cleaned separately from the wheels and may eventually wear out and lose their shape. Not a good idea for an engine that you want to keep around for a while. Now let's take a good close-up look at the locomotive itself. We note the front has a very prominent headlamp and brass bell. The headlight itself, I have to say, it appears to be an LED and has a very bright light that it flashes outward with. We also note the Minuteman logo, again that's from the Boston and Maine Railroad, and the fake knuckle coupler on the front. Also the short stubby smokestack. The side railing is in fact metal, but it's a bit on the shiny side for being a fully realistic model. But again, we have to remember that AHM is more of an economy retailer, it always has been, trying to balance sort of performance with economy itself. We also note the steam generator on the top of the locomotive. This is to actually take steam pressure off the boiler and essentially generate electrical current to power windshield wipers and cab lights and other minimal accessories inside the locomotive, including the radio. Now let's take a good look at the tender. As we see, it has a coal load in there, and I apologize for the rough camera work. I was still getting used to this camera. The load itself comes out looking pretty realistic in my opinion, although admittedly I don't review a lot of steam engines. Again, pardon my rough camera work here. We see also that it has a taillight on it, rather, and that does in fact work when you reverse the locomotive. As we turn to the other side of the locomotive, we get a good view of that steam generator I was speaking about before, and a few other nice little plastic details thrown in. On the second dome, we see that that's in fact a whistle, I believe, mounted there. We also see the valving put all around. Again, this is all kind of molded in detailing. But once more, I must remind everyone that this is supposed to be sort of an economy model, mixing quality with economy. So that end, I'm not expecting hardcore detailing with it. And here's another good shot of that coal load. Again, I think that looks pretty good for what it is. It does its job well enough. Well, that'll do it for the basic details of this engine. Now let's take a look and see how she runs. Again, function 1 is your horn and function 2 is your bell, much like the standard sound-equipped locomotives. The slow crawl of this engine's a little bit rough now, but it's smoothing out. I've already run this engine since quite a bit, although I still find it a bit of a jerky affair at lower speeds. The engine also has a weird tendency to stall, which I'll show more later on. We also see the operating reverse tender light that comes on when the locomotive is backing up. And the locomotive is backing up or reversing into a specially prepared consist of none other than the Liberty Bell set from Bachmann, of course minus its usual steam engine. As you watch the cars join, we note the coupler on the tender is actually slightly low. That's a weird quirk which I've attempted to solve by tightening the coupler itself, but I found that the screw itself doesn't seem to have any bite beyond a certain point, and so as not to damage anything, I decided not to turn the screw further. I'm also going to avoid taking this locomotive apart any further to look at the motor type drive or the decoder, as I am still under the 30-day return policy, and I've run into far too many headaches with steam locomotives as of recent when I've been as I've attempted to review them, so I'm not taking any chances with this one. And off she goes. Where she's heading, no one knows. Well, to be honest, I of course do. We'll start with the second track right there with its tighter 18-inch sections and close clearances to see how the engine deals with those. We'll then take the train onto the innermost track where it will be tested on the tight, twisty 18-inch curves and a few of the 22-inch sections I have there and the other S-curves I have set up. And then finally we'll finish up by taking the engine up and around the mountain. As we can see, the train had no issue with that tight section underneath the wooden trestle back there. That's where a lot of the steam engines tend to run aground against the side because of their length. This one is very well articulated and had no trouble coming around the curve, nor did it run afoul of any of the tight clearances on that section. Now let's switch her over to the third main line and see how she does on the S-curves. As we can see, the IHC 462 handled them without breaking a sweat. Now let's give this thing a real test. Let's see how she handles the tight and twisty and very treacherous ascent up Whitestone Mountain. Looks like we got a little wheel slippage here. Luckily, the locomotive has enough oomph to get past the point. Now arriving, Whitestone Station. And as the passengers leave and board the train, I can definitely conclude this locomotive handled my mountain quite well, with the exception of some wheel slippage going up the mountain. Again, I note this locomotive does not have a lot of pulling power to it. But I must note, and I'm sure everyone else has noted, that this motor seems a bit on the rough side. You can hear it clicking away there. Again, I'm not sure of the exact amount of time this locomotive was sitting in its box new, or what its history is beyond a certain point. Again, the locomotive didn't even come with the proper paperwork. What I can say is that even though it does run a little rough, it is certainly well within expectations and does the job pretty much all around. Now let's get the passengers over to Midville, where we'll complete the testing for this particular review. And with the passengers safely detrained, let's go ahead and give this locomotive a crawl test. As we see, the controls are a bit on the finicky side on low speeds. The engine's very jerky in particular. As we see, I'm on speed step 2, and the engine is going a bit on the fast side for a crawl. Now, I'm sure there are ways of probably tweaking the decoder, but I dare not, as we'll see in a second as to why. Again, set at 0, the unit is still moving, and that's without any momentum programmed into it. Again, this is the Tsunami 1, I believe, not the Tsunami 2. I also note the locomotive had a tendency to stall out during this part of the test quite frequently. And I checked, it is not because of the tracks, they are in fact clean. This is apparently down to the fact that the decoder itself appears to have an issue with the amount of voltage being drawn by the motor, which will tend to spike when an electric motor like this one is stopped completely but is having power applied to it. And so very clearly this locomotive is not a crawler. And as I back this beautiful machine up to the station, it's time for me to give my thoughts Thoughts and final conclusion of this review. I wasn't expecting much from an IHC locomotive, especially considering the rather infamous Christmas I had back in 1996 with an earlier model that was very similar to this one, which essentially disintegrated into a pile of, well, nothing about a month later. This particular locomotive itself, however, impressed me in every way. The sound effects worked decently enough, the operating worked decently enough, the lights functioned, the detailing is crude, admittedly the slow speed running is a little bit rough, and there are a lot of unrefined areas, including that infamous power plug and the long distance between the engine and the drawbar. But that said, it did everything I asked it to do. It made it up my mountain without derailing, it made it through all the twisty sections of my railroad, it did everything else that the past steamers I've had on this railroad failed to do. So I really can't complain much at all. Bottom line, this locomotive is not a Cadillac, it's not a Rolls-Royce, it's a Chevy. And that's perfectly fine as long as it works like a Chevy, reliable, dependable, and does its job. It doesn't have any fancy features, the detailing is crude, and it's a little bit rough running at slow speeds. But beyond that, it does everything it's supposed to do it, and at a much cheaper price, especially when you consider the average price of a steam engine with sound is heading toward $400. With sound, this locomotive sold for just under $200. Which is not bad at all if you consider that this is essentially a turnkey product with the DCC and sound decoder all set to go. All one has to do is basically put it on the track and program it. Bottom line, this is a definite buy if you can find one, although good luck finding one as IHC has been shut down for a while now. That said, I stumbled onto something interesting on the internet a while back. A company apparently calling itself IHC Hobby Texas apparently has bought out the stocks that IHC had before it shut down. This same outfit appears to have also acquired all of Model Power's stocks left from when the company was essentially shut down by MRC and the rights sold over to Lionel. So this is a very interesting development and certainly gives us out there who are interested in acquiring these locomotives and rolling stock from these two former companies a final chance to get them. And if you are interested, you better be quick, as it appears that once these stocks are gone, that's going to be game over, unless of course Mehano starts importing them again. And before I close out this review, I'd like to give some credit as usual to hoseeker.net. If it wasn't for this archive, I would not have been able to get the materials I used for this review. If you're looking for information on vintage trains, this is a great place to check out. Or if you have any literature you'd like to share with the community, I encourage you to stop by. Again, that website is hoseeker.net. And that's going to do it for this review. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If not, give it a thumbs down. Please subscribe, and thank you once again for watching. And as always, keep the metal side down.